Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm just doing this quick video to just say, voice my mind surrounding on issues surrounding global anti-slavery and Black Lives movements. As we all know, following the murder of George Floyd, we have seen protests, rallies, and peaceful demonstrations in many parts of the world. We have seen the massive protests in the US, people standing in, joining forces and standing against racism, and in this side of the Atlantic as well, in Europe, in London, in different parts of England, in Wales, in Scotland, and in other European countries as well. There have been protests just voicing and standing with people who are demanding rights. And it's quite so encouraging to see people of all color joining forces to stand against injustice, to stand against racism, to stand against injustice, and to stand for the values of human rights. It's incredible. It's amazing to see the statues of those people, those key figures who were involved in slave trades, pulled down. Statues of slave trade, slave drivers, and people who had made lucrative amount of money out of the misery of the slaves were pulled down, not just in US but in many parts of Europe as well. I've seen one pulled down in Bristol, which is only across the bridge to where I live. And protests, we have seen protests and rallies and peaceful demonstrations, even at local level in small towns up and down the country. So the reason why I'm doing this video is, one, to show my appreciation to the global community, to the international community, for taking that action, the action to show solidarity, the demanding justice and demanding an end to slavery again, and also saying Black Lives Matters. On this video, I just want to focus on the slave trade aspect of it and the statues of those slave drivers being pulled down. Whenever we talk about slave trade, of course, slavery still exists. For that matter, there are evidence suggesting that slavery is one of the largest lucrative sector, illegal lucrative sector, only next to, I think, illegal drugs and firearms. So it still exists, but whenever we talk about the statues being pulled down, we're talking about the statues or about the system that prevailed in 19th century, in 18th century. But the demonstrations and the peaceful protest and the statues that got demolished in both sides of the Atlantic in relation to what happened in the 18th century, what happened in the 19th century, and the racism that has continued to prevail in various forms today. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is, with regard to pulling down statues, and whenever expressing anger and protest against racism, I think the global community should not tolerate complacence and hypocrisy in in whatever they do, in whatever is being undertaken. I guess the international community has to operate in zero level tolerance to complacency, zero level tolerance to hypocrisy. So I just want to make 2 points here. With regard to the statues of those figures who were involved in slave trade directly, it's great to pull down the statues of those figures, in Europe and in the US, but the people whose statues are pulled down are only those who were at one end of the slave trade, or of the chain, so to say. So in order for this effort, in order for the movement to bring about sustainable change, I submit to the international community that both the statues of the slave dealers at the one end of the chain, and the statues of those slave suppliers should also be equally pulled down. And particularly, I want to focus on Africa. As we all know, many of the victims of slave trade, whether there are people who were driven to the Caribbean to work in the sugar plantation, whether we're talking about the victims of slave trade who were forced to work hard, to build America, or to build big cities in Europe. We are talking about those people of African origin. Now, on the other hand, it was not the Ferengis, as we call, it was not the white men and women who went to African villages, hunted people down, snatched children from their parents and adults, and at gunpoint, forced them at gunpoint, chained them together and shipped them over. No, that's not the case. It was slave trade was possible because there were African emperors and leaders, whatever you call them, that perpetuated, that collaborated with the Europeans, that assisted the Europeans. And for that matter, it was the African emperors themselves who went to the villages and towns, African towns and villages, and captured people at gunpoint or at sword point and supplied them to the Europeans. So it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make lots of sense to see those African emperors now praised and worshipped, and their statues being erected in the capital of Africa, and say, just to just focus on one end, on the other, the suppliers, the distributors end of the slave trade. I'm just taking that analogy as to just exemplify whatever I'm talking. So slave trade was a trade. That means there was supply and demand, and there were suppliers and there were distributors, just for example. So if the African emperors, if the African leaders in the quotation, were not involved, if they had not been for the fact that the African leaders, African emperors, were involved in hunting down their own people, in killing their own people, in capturing their own people, and in selling them to the European, had not been for this participation of the Africans, slave trade wouldn't have materialized. This is a simple logic. Let me give you an example of what, which African leaders were involved. Whenever we talk about slave drivers of the 19th century. Apparently, we are talking about historical events. We're talking in relation to this, always inseparable is the colonization of Africa. We're talking about the partition of Africa. We're talking about the scramble for Africa. So in this conversation, obviously what comes out very big is the Berlin Conference, or the scramble for Africa. The occasion where all the European colonial establishments, colonial leaders of the day came together in 1882 to 1884, sat at the table and partitioned Africa among themselves. So effectively, Africa was put on the table as a stake to be shared among the Europeans themselves. So it was after that the King Leopold of Belgium, the atrocities that we saw in Congo and other, the rest of it happened. So whatever the Europeans agreed at the Berlin Conference, whatever plan they drew, couldn't have been successful if the Ethiopian emperors were involved. Had it not been for the fact that Ethiopian emperors participated in that process, perhaps that evil plan of the European colonial establishments couldn't have been successful. One of these emperors is Emperor Menelik of Ethiopia. That is, a very controversial figure. Some people want to say, oh, Menelik defeated Italy and scored victory, black victory over the white people. But if we see the events surrounding that with eyes wide opened, we see, in fact, whatever happened in Adwa was a victory of, black colonizer over the white colonizer. So we need to see what, in the events what happened before the conflict and after the conflict. Menelik had participated already in the partition of Africa, and not just Menelik, the other Ethiopian emperors also were involved in that process. We can cite many examples. We can cite the Hewit Treaty, how the Hewit Treaty was implemented. That is another story. We can mention the Wuchale Treaty. That was a treaty between Italy and Ethiopian emperor in early 1880s. It was that very same treaty that about a decade later led to war between the Abyssinia and Italy. Now, that's not my point. My point is, why did, in the first place, Menelik signed that agreement? Why did Menelik collaborated with Italy 10 years before the war? That's the point we've got to see. Menelik signed agreement with Italy to assist Italy. If we read the terms of the agreement, to assist Italy, one, to expand its colonial territory in East Africa, namely assisted Italy to capture Eritrea, part of the current day Sudan, states like Saitet, Kassala, and others, and also assisted Italy to expand its territories to the current day Somalia and the rest of it. Similar things were undertaken by Emperor Johannes of Abyssinia as well, who signed the Hewit Treaty. with British to assist the British colonial establishment to expand to capture Sudan. For example, one incident we can mention is when the Sudanese freedom fighters encircled the British, they call it the Anglo-Egyptian forces, and asked Ethiopia, Emperor Yohannes of Ethiopia, to assist them to defeat the Sudanese freedom fighters, with, which Yohannes happily did. So now when we see this, why did the Ethiopian emperors collaborated with Italy, with Britain, with France? Is because they were interested, one, in trade, which primarily was involving in slave trade, and two, because emperors like Menelik were desperate for firearms, which the Europeans happily supplied, and Menelik used that firearms to invade Africans in, those countries in the current day Ethiopia, and to supply slaves. At a point, there is a mountain of evidence showing that Emperor Menelik and other emperors, yeah, we can mention numerous scientific evidence to vividly show that Ethiopian emperors are involved in the slave trade, and the leaders of Ethiopia even now are indirectly being involved in the slave trade. I will explain that, what I meant by that, later on. One example we can mention is the scholarly work of Richard Pancras. Richard Pancras is one of the leading scholars known for his work in Africa, and particularly in Ethiopia. I must mention many of the writings during the imperial Ethiopia were biased and written in favor of the whatever was happening, whatever was going on in the palace. I don't think Richard Pancras is exceptional to that in many of his writings. But despite that, when it comes to how the Ethiopian emperors involved, he vividly describes. He gives figure. If you read his book titled "The Economic History of Ethiopia," this book, I've got it here. Can you see it? Economic History of Ethiopia. So he gives figure. This is a very comprehensive book. He gives figure, with all kinds of evidence. If you read the book on page 75, Richard Pancras writes, Menelik and Taitu owned 20,000 slaves at the palace in Addis Ababa. Addis Ababa is the capital of Africa. The indigenous people, the Oromo, call it Finfinne. So 20,000 slaves just in the palace in Addis Ababa, and a further 50,000 elsewhere. If you take this figure just conservatively, 50,000 elsewhere, while Ras Alula Wolde-Georgis had 20,000, Ras Tasemma, these are his subordinates, people, his war leaders, Rasalula would Ras Wild, I'm sorry, it's not Rasalula. Ras Wildegorgis had 20,000, Ras Tasemma 6,000, and Ras Mikhail had 3,000. So it all together, these are, by the way, Ras is a title, like colonel general. So slaves were individual for they are just treated like commodity, like items. So the emperor himself, he owned more than just imperial property, 20,000 in the palace, in the capital, and 50,000 elsewhere. So, and together with if we add the amount, the number of slaves owned by his subordinates, more than 100,000 slaves were owned by the government at one time. So these were people who were captured at gunpoint, people who were captured by the emperor's soldiers. They're not the ones who were captured. The white guys had never involved in this process. So these 100,000 men and women were owned by the emperor at one point. Probably those are the people who were ready for shipment. So what we see now, you know, let me get back to the point of pulling down statues. You know, when the people who were involved in global anti-slavery movement pulled down the statues in Bristol, in US, in different cities of Africa, we have to question ourselves also. How about the statues of those people who went to the villages and captured people, snatched children of their parents, you know, captured fathers, mothers at gunpoint and sold them, handed them over to the European colonial establishment, the likes of Emperor Menelik, who, you know, at one point had 100,000 men and women ready for shipment. So that's the question I want to put to you know, the global movement. What do we know? How much do we know about people like such as Emperor Menelik? You know, Finfinne being the capital of Africa, I bet every sitting head of the state of every African country would have visited Finfinne, because that is the capital of Africa. That is the seat of the African Union. So that means every leader of Africa would have seen the statue of Emperor Menelik erected right at the center of the capital, Finfinne, the capital of Africa. I'll show you the statue. Just give me one moment. Yeah, I've got it here. Let me show you whose statue I'm talking about. It is give me 1 second. Let me show you this video. Before I begin to play the video, I must warn you, there's some graphic stuff that you might see, so yeah, view this at your own discretion. As you can see on this video, these are the soldiers of the government of Ethiopia burning villages down because these are villages. As you can see, it's a hut, it's a thatched roof house of a family. They suspected of the family members are suspected by the government soldiers of holding a view that they thought is in support of the Oromo Liberation Front. This is when here you can see the kind of torture. This is a graphic video, as you can see. The soldiers of the government of Ethiopia setting villages on fire. It's a known practice that they burn houses down with people inside. This is the video footage taken a few days ago. It has widely been circulating on the social media. From what soldiers are saying, what we can see from this video based on what the soldiers are chatting is that the family members are allegedly associated or sympathize with the Oromo Liberation Front. That's why their houses are being set on fire. And this, by the way, this is another video footage overwhelmingly. This is a graphic video, as you can see. The soldiers of the government of Ethiopia setting villages on fire. It's a known practice that they burn houses down with people inside. This is the video footage taken a few days ago. It has widely been circulating on the social media. From what soldiers are saying, what we can see from this video based on what the soldiers are chatting is that the family members are allegedly associated or sympathize with the Oromo Liberation Front. That's why their houses are being set on fire. And this, by the way, this is another video footage overwhelmingly dominating on social media, circulating widely on the social media, how the government soldiers are mistreating I showed you those videos, and the pictures, very graphic videos, very graphic pictures, showing how the Ethiopian, government led by the Nobel Peace Laureate Abiy Ahmed is committing serious crimes against humanity. It's been reported by human rights organizations recently, such as Amnesty International, the Human Rights Watch, and other credible international human rights institutions, that the government of Abiy Ahmed is using torture, arbitrary mass killing, arbitrary arrest to silence the people to submit. Kids as young as 5 years old, elderly, parents, mothers, all innocent people brutally murdered by the government soldiers. There are evidence suggesting that just in the past 2 years, more than 8,000 people have been illegally killed by the government soldiers. About 20,000 people are currently languishing in prison, and every day we've been receiving reports of killings and people being burned down alive in their house, as you've seen in the video. And we can see this from overwhelming reports by international media. So I'm not making these allegations. There are facts out there, and the point is, how is this? How are these crimes against humanity linked with the slave trade, or modern day slavery? That's the point. Because of the atrocities, because of the arbitrary arrest, arbitrary killing, torture, deliberate starvation, people like myself flee the country. Not everyone gets the opportunity. I did have opportunity to just board on plane, work my way out, and claim asylum here. That is by chance, because I had access to visa and the rest of it. I don't want to go into that detail, but thousands and thousands of Oromo young men and women who are fleeing Oromia, they just try to get out of the country, go somewhere where they can find safety, where they can conduct their life safely. But what's happening now is they end up in the hands of gangs that are involved in modern slavery. To be precise, we have all seen what was going on in Libya in 2018, when the CNN and other international media outlets revealed people were being sold in open market. Those are not just figures; they are sisters, brothers, niece and nieces who were just running out of the country, fleeing persecution, and they end up in the hands of the gangsters. So the Oromos are not exception to this. There were many Oromo people, there are many Oromo young men and women who ended up in the hands of slave drivers in Libya. There are many Oromo young men and women who die in just the ship or the boats sinking on the Mediterranean, and there are lots of tragedies. I remember in 2016, more than 150 Oromo men and women were drowned on the Mediterranean, and still as the situation is getting worse and worse, more and more people are fleeing home, and these people who are fleeing home end up in the hands of slave drivers. So indirectly, by forcing the people to flee home, the government of Abiy Ahmed is facilitating modern slavery. That's the point I've been trying to make. So it doesn't make lots of sense to the international community, for the international community to pull down the statues of slave drivers, the figures from the 18th century in Europe, in London, in Bristol, and in America, on one hand, and on the other hand, at least their government, who they've voted, are supporting the governments such as that of Abiy Ahmed. You know, Ethiopia receives nearly 30 to 40% of its budget in foreign aid from this country. So I guess my point is the international community should begin to focus on these kinds of things as well. As long as, you know, the supply is there when it comes to the modern day slavery, as long as the supply is there, there will be slavery. People are fleeing home, ending up in the hands of slave drivers, being sold in open market, as we have seen just 2 years ago in Libya. And, you know, well, with regard to pulling down the statues, of course, it's great to pull down the statues of those figures in Europe and in America, but how about the statues of those African leaders, such as Emperor Menelik, whose statue is still being erected in the capital of Africa, in Finfinne, where the African leaders take as a base for African Union? That statue also needs to be pulled down. The international community have to stand for value, irrespective of, you know, they have to oppose slavery, irrespective of who were the perpetrators of this crime. So thank you very much. I will get back to you with another video. Thank you for paying attention, for sharing this. Thank you.